Hello, everybody. So let's kick things off with a shower thought that John had.
Yeah. So actually, we started a new campaign with Mr. Ian Olson as the DM. It's a nice distanced game based around Curse.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to today's episode of the DM Shower Thoughts, the show where we talk about our shower thoughts in 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons and other tabletop scenarios and how to become your best self through gaming. My name is Adamus.
I'm Jen.
I'm Ian.
Hello, everybody. So let's kick things off with a shower thought that John had.
Yeah. So actually, we started a new campaign with Mr. Ian Olson as the DM. It's a nice distanced game based around Curse of Strahd, and one of the things that really clicked for me is first he asked a question which is really cool about how it was the game designed for this, and it had to do with perception checks, and it was the game designed for basically calling for perception checks more than any other check. And it was a question that I thought was like it. I have an answer, and it's not necessarily the best answer or a complete answer, but at least kind of gets you started on the same. A lot of better questions to ask yourself too. Not that that wasn't a good question because obviously it made lots of other stuff happen, but it made me immediately think back to there's a difference between how the game was designed and how the game is played, right? So, for example, the game was all of the features and power balances are designed under the assumption that you have 6 to 8 encounters per long rest. And you commonly use the short rest system in between, like every 2 fights or so, right? Nobody does that because a lot of times it doesn't really help with the pacing of the story as much to have that many combat encounters, especially since a lot of people like us tend to like the social interaction part of the game a little bit more than just combat after combat after combat. And when you start looking at certain classes like Warlock and Fighter, their design makes sense in the context of 6 to 8 encounters per long rest with short rests sprinkled in between. But it starts to really fall off in power in how the game is actually played, which is like a lot of talking, exploration, set piece encounter. So my answer with the perception checks thing is the game, a lot of times DMs call for perception checks because ultimately the games deliver, like the information delivered to the players is done so through the DM narrating, right? So, and the only way that you as the DM can like quantitatively determine how much information to give the players is through perception. Perception covers all sensory input. It's like you can have a perception check based on smell or sight or hearing or touch, all that different stuff. So whether or not you have to call for a check though versus just using the perception score is also a different topic for debate. So for me, I try to limit the amount of perception checks unless a player is specifically asking for one. I use their passive perception, right? Because it cuts down on rolling, cuts down on time. The character that makes sense to notice things is the one that notices them. Like we've had that where it's like I built my investigator character, but this bard with a -1 wisdom happened to roll high, so they notice the secret door, but not the so like story-wise, when you're creating a team where everyone has their niche, you want the person that built towards a certain niche to be able to be good in the thing that their niche is, So I find the passive scores work a lot better for that. But then I started thinking as I was thinking of how the game is designed versus how the game is played, I had this weird realization. Because as we've noticed, especially highlighted through doing D&D online, when you have a team of 4 players and you add in a 5th player, that can really change the dynamic of the table. It can cause a lot of slowdown. It can cause a lot of a little bit of confusion on roles and stuff, especially if roles start to overlap. And when you take away a player, so you have 4 players and you take away one, so you're only left with 3, there's a feeling of incompleteness where you can have a satisfying story with like 2 or 3 players, but it doesn't feel as rich as having 4. And of course, we all know that the game was designed for a dungeon master and then 4 to 6 player characters, although even the Dungeon Master's Guide says 6 is really kind of pushing it. If you can keep it 4 or 5, that works. And what I, especially playing through Ian's game, the scenario, and I was watching how the characters interacted with each other, who tended to gravitate towards who, and how they would set up the dynamics. And the reason is Chrono Trigger. So Chrono Trigger, as an SNES game, had this mechanic called dual and triple attacks, where every character had a combo attack with at least with every other character, and they had a triple attack based on every possible party composition that you could make for each character. That's why when you add in one extra player, it's one more combo you have to now account for. So it's basically every permutation and every combination of dynamics that are happening within a party. So like, let's say the 3 of us are a party and we have a mystery dungeon master. There's a dynamic between Adam's character and my character. There's a dynamic between my character and Ian's character. There's a dynamic between those 2, and then there's the dynamic of the 3 of us working together. Now if you add in an NPC, and the DM is really, and I've had this with another DM too, where he's trying to put as much emphasis on an NPC story as the player characters. It's adding an extra dynamic that we have to manage now, and it's unnecessary. We're not telling a better story because of it. He might be feeling he's getting a different story, but the party's dynamics aren't enriched. It feels overweight is the only term that's coming to mind.
Is it like oversaturated, or it's
oversaturated might be a good way to put it. But now if you think about that, if you add in a 4th player, right? Now you've got to deal with their dynamics and our dynamics and their dynamics and all of us working as a team, or the 3 of us being on one side and them being on another side, or 2 and 2. Like, all of a sudden, if you do the math, the possibilities, right, start to become not exponential. I don't think that's the right, the math term for it, but the possibilities start to expand at a pretty great rate. And then adding a 5th person and 6th, 7th, when you've got Gray Owls and you have a 12-person party, think about the amount of possible relationships and dynamics that now have to be managed. It becomes unwieldy, So it's when you start looking at the number of players that you're working with, that's why I can feel that adding this player in is really bogging down play. It's because now, especially if the other characters are respectful and story driven, they're going to have to find ways to integrate them in their dynamics,
So with 4 players, it's about 16 possible combinations between the 1 player and all the other players and all that stuff. And then if you add 1 more person, it becomes 25 because it's 5 squared. With 12 players, it's 144 possible combinations.
And are you also accounting for like the different layers too?
Yeah, so, and of course, like if there's subtext to each character, it becomes even more than that. So even just adding 3 to that, like 3 different sub layers to each character, it becomes even more unwieldy, as you said. So
and remember, I didn't even mention the player or the party's relationship with the dungeon master as a player, right? Because a lot of times, as we know, you can have the same dungeon master DMing the same way, and 2 different players will react very differently to them, based on the same call. So I've seen that before too, where a dungeon master will be like, oh, let's stretch the ability of this spell, do an arcana check. And one player being like, oh, it's really cool, there's that possibility. And another player being like, why can't I just do it? And it's like the same call with the same tone. It's just, that's an extra dynamic that you have to pay attention to now.
Yeah, we think about there are two things that spring to mind here, and one is just finished watching a Critical Role episode, and a Critical Role is run when they have their full cast of people. It's 7 characters at once, and they fought a monster, and they just like 7 people got 6 of the 7 got a surprise round. Essentially, the creature was surprised, and he runs the surprise round. But you had all these abilities go right in a row. The monster got 1 turn, and there's a point where the DM kind of stepped back and went, well, yeah, it's not that hard when you got 7 people ganging up on one monster that doesn't have legendary actions. It's a dinosaur. Of course you guys wreck it. And yeah, that's one way. And I've seen that in their play style, but they have a very distinct social contract where it's a show. And they make sure to not, like, there are certain things at the table that they just don't even engage in those ways because it's a scene between 2 people and they just stay out of it.
Mhm.
Whereas when you're not in a show scenario, you have a different social contract, so things can often get a little muddier. And there are pros and cons to both of those things. The other thing that comes up here is that Gray Owls, what began, because Gray Owls came off of Night Owls. Night Owls, it was more mission combat driven. Even though I put it out there in the beginning, this is probably going to be more social heavy. We didn't know how heavy that would be until we were experiencing it. And when we were experiencing it, that's when those core relationships started happening. And then from a dynamics perspective, recognizing that as more time went on, we didn't want a rotating cast in any way, shape, or form. And it was always so painful when someone had to miss something that it really became a problem. So you can't have people miss things. Well, if you can't have people miss things, then we have a party of 10 people. That is insane. And we felt that. And then when we split it up, that became more appropriate to create stronger bonds. But then the bonds that we had already established from those previous 10, 12 chapters weren't discarded, but they become sort of sidelined. They're not as important or intimate and impactful as the relationships you're making with this other party. I like that we went into detail on this before, but it has really brought into the idea of moving forward that there are some groups that work really well with 4, and there are some groups that feel weird with 4, and those groups are highly beneficial with 5. And then maybe there are groups that don't feel very complete at 5 who are beneficial with 6. And then some groups that are overwhelming at 6. It's all about the dynamics between the players and the characters. You could have certain roles fulfilled with 4 and still be lacking a very specific role. And then you get that role fulfilled at 5, and then suddenly everything synergizes and it's like smooth sailing. There's a lot less resistance. And yet you could feel somehow impacted by having 4 of certain types of players playing and be benefited by 3 in some way, and then try to find a different role that comes in as the other 4th player. A lot of this is player dynamics, how players interact, their relationships to each other as people, and then their relationships to each other as characters, and the resistances and flow that comes from all of those different factors. I guess my end point is 4 to 6 players, and that can fluctuate table to table, group to group, even with as little as 1 person changing, even as little as different campaign, different setting. Same players, completely different characters could change the entire dynamic.
It's interesting because it just shows how versatile, I guess you could say, D&D is as a game. That there's so much freedom in it, and there's so many things that players can do to change what they're doing in the game. And it brings people together in some of the weirdest ways sometimes. And I really like that. Off of what you were saying about how the players interacted with each other, it made me think about how, as a DM, it might just become more valuable for us to basically pick the players at our tables that work best together whenever we're creating a new campaign or something. And the reason for that is just because some people might not like each other or something like that. And I think I think that can be really beneficial because even though it sounds a little like stringent, a bit restrictive, it's better in some ways, like to please those 4 people. Like say you have like a pool of 12 players or something like that, and you just want to create the best experience possible. Well, the best experience possible might just come with these 4 players being in the same table and some other 4 players being in the same table, and those other 2 and those 2 groups not interacting at all as players or characters. And some people might be like, well, I wanted to kind of play with that guy. And it's like, well, yeah, but like at this point, I feel like I know you guys well enough to say, I think you're going to probably have the best time with these guys, even if sometimes you crack a joke or something with one of these other players. But that's just me theorizing.
And it isn't to say that you could have 4 and 4, and then 2 of that group and 2 of the other group split off and do a one-shot together, so they can still play together.
Yeah.
And that can be fine. It just, these stories might be separate for the mutual benefit of both groups.
Yeah.
You elevate both groups by separating them.
It's very interesting how that works sometimes. The other thing I was going to say was about Night Owls, how it kind of, it's more combative than Gray Owls. And you said something that, so I was thinking about how in Night Owls, we had an overarching story that was going on, even if not everyone was there to witness the story all the time. And assuming that some people felt, slightly disappointed at having missed key story points, I was thinking what it would be like to have a campaign that is only Monster of the Week and basically no overarching story. Basically just a series of one-shots where you just take the Night Owls initiative, and you're only on the mission, and there is no bigger, badder guy. And I don't I like stories and stuff, so that's not a real big deal to me. But I was thinking about it and what that would be like for players as an experience.
There's a casual investment protocol that comes in there where, if you're only doing a Monster of the Week, I can see that, I get to cycle out this character. And I think originally that's what was really intended. But as people started to imbibe their own development into, I brought this character back and they learned from this last time, and to have that rotating cast, it made it so it felt a lot more like, Justice League Unlimited, where there were Monster of the Week shows, but there's an overarching theme. And I liked that. But then, especially this last season, became a lot more invested in terms of that story. Whereas in previous seasons, people would miss stuff and they go, that's fine. And this one, people would miss a spot and go, oh man, I don't want to miss I don't want to miss the next one. And it was very, very different.
Yeah.
So when it came time for the climax, get into that, it became logistically impossible to run. I had to rush to schedule it, and it really messed things up, and I couldn't run both groups at the same time. And but in the past 2 seasons, that wasn't a big deal. But this time it really stung, and it really messed it up in terms of the stuff in the background of, I felt like I really made a huge mistake in not being able to have everyone at once. Because normally I would have put all the butts in the seats and done it, but Roll20 would have crashed.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. So there's a lot that we just covered that I've been taking notes on to pack a little. So the first thing just being, Adam, what you mentioned of player to player relationships, that, one of the things that I've been really has been guiding how I DM a lot is, you want to DM in a way that encourages your players to develop the habits you want them to see in play, right? So if I make the assumption that my players can't keep track of stuff, or they don't like inventory management, I'm actually going to limit my fun DMing and their fun playing. So a lot of what you guys just said are what I've been really trying to do with Geras, right? That's a Monster of the Week one shot where you can have two different players with two, it's one shot to one shot. And there is a little bit of an overarching story happening with your group, but there's not that story happening with the other group, So, and it was really cool because like last night's game, which is what kind of started this off, like there was a point where Stephanie's character, she said as a character, they feel they're on a journey they didn't sign up for, that they were just a plucky, go-lucky, like, traveler, and suddenly they're dropped into gothic horror, and they're trying to figure out how to deal with that. But as and then Ian was like, oh man, I'm sorry if I didn't, and she's like, no, I knew you, running Curse of Strahd, it's the vampire, we've done this before, like, we did a whole prequel campaign, like, as a player, I knew what I was signing up for, but I'm role-playing a character, so it's like there's like that trust dynamic, player to player. And that's when you can get really cool stuff to happen in game, is when you have players that are sensible and respectful, So the thing with Critical Role, really what you're looking at for that is you're looking at it, is it a performance or a story, And for me personally, and this of course isn't everybody, because obviously Critical Role is a much bigger thing than whatever I'm doing. Like, to me, I actually end up caring more about the story than the performance. I don't care if anybody makes funny voices at my table. I like having a story that we can record and look back on, which is why I utilize chat the way I do, where I have everyone write down and record what their character says and does, so that when I craft the narrative later with everyone's permission and everybody's edits, like, we have something really collaborative and cool that we've all made together. And then the last thing is like kind of what Adamus was saying with where Grey Owls is at. This only lends weight to the thing we talked about last week, which is legacy games, right? So being able to play a legacy character and deepen relationships that may have so far gone unresolved, that's like the meat of what the game is about. It's finding those, even inside of a grandiose conflict, it's the intimate moments. Like today, Adam, you posted a blog post that I did for the 10 character chapters. And if you think about Avatar: The Last Airbender, Aang defeating the Fire Lord is important because it's what he's supposed to do. But his journey is about telling Katara how he feels about her. That's not a grandiose conflict with a big fight at the end. But that's really the arc of his character, is being honest with her, And, as an airbender, he had this problem with earthbending. He would always try to find the clever solution. He couldn't just stand his ground and deal with it, So he never did. If you notice, most of his biggest emotional conflicts, his first instinct was to run away, which is the first thing that ended up him in the iceberg in the first place. He would rather run away. He even lied at some point, like especially when he was with Bato, when he took the letter, That's an airbender move. Run away, retreat, escape, reposition. So it is funny how like those legacy games will help tell the intimate moments and resolve them more so that there's not time for it in the grandiose story,
Yeah.
So I'm really looking forward to just the breadth of what that's going to offer, more than anything else right now.
Oh, yeah. In Shadowfell today, I just finished a game because we swapped it around for a few other things, but I'm noticing, especially with this young adult group, that they learned the game in a combat heavy campaign in their first campaign, and then they did a second campaign where they had a mixture of a lot more exploration and some combat, like epic level combat. And then this one, Shadowfell was just, and we've said it before, is meant to be it's kind of like their version of Grey Owls. It's kind of darker, it's grittier, everything's a bit tighter, and they're seeing tragic, maybe not the best word, but they're seeing consequences. They're seeing the longer consequences to their actions, and their poor decisions, whatever they were. Or maybe they were great decisions, who knows? They're decisions. They're seeing that. And and I find it really interesting because they find so much value in the conversations and the connections that they're making with each other and with the NPCs of the world. I'm opening the door a lot more to say, if you want to have character interactions right now, you can. And when you're ready, I'll move on to the next scene, or we'll close for the evening so everyone goes to sleep and you get your long rest. And by opening that door, I have so many more times now where people say, "Oh, I take this person aside, and I go knock on this person's door. You know what? I want to go talk to the orcs at the orc table and see what they're all about. I want to chat with the undead bartender that's like a ghost that they're talking to." And they're opting into so many more conversations. Then they also get to see those connections further down the line. They had a certain interaction with a princess visiting from a far off land, and they sent her away with some really interesting persuasion and deception checks. And she's gonna come up later, and we don't know. They don't know how. And I love that they're the seeds of chaos. They're seeing, okay, let's put this here and see what happens. But it's not an audience thing for them. They're pushing things in motion, and they are very interested in what is going to transpire from their past decisions. And one of their past decisions, who is a bounty hunter who is sent, at least upon their scent, has shown up in the city that they are currently residing in. And they've been maybe not running from them, but definitively leaving the places that they were at, and only to find this creature sort of catching up to them has been really interesting, because, oh yeah, she was looking for us. Oh yeah, we left that city behind. She got a ship and she's following us. And they get to see that and go, wait, we may have to get out of here, or we may have to face her, we may have to throw her off of our scent. And these have ripple effects that they've now felt from their past campaign that affected the Shadowfell. They're learning about news that transpired while they were in the Underdark, in the material world, and the parallels that cause these ripples to show up now in the Shadowfell. And they're like nudging each other, going, wait, that was us, wait a second. Or they mention a character, wait, that was the character that I retired, that left, and I came up out with a new character. Oh, they've been running around. And that's been really cool to see that in this sort of shorter form. Makes me very excited for Night Owl Season 4, which has been proposed in one facet as Dark Owls, which is what would happen if we had a Monster of the Week evil campaign that was in against like the Night Owls, which could be really interesting and might offer a new spin to see the parallels that could happen and the ripple effects. Or we could switch off, where one team is the Dark Owls of the evil group and the other team is the standard heroic fare. And what if they were acting in opposition to each other? That could be really neat, because then there's an interplay that doesn't have to be at the same table, which I would be also very curious about. But I'm very excited about seeing, now that we've had a lot of campaigns that I've closed that have now lineage in this whole timeline, to be able to show more and more of that legacy and more of those ripples that people have made in the world. Just really cool.
Dark Owl sounds interesting, and it reminds me of the Dark Brotherhood quest line in Oblivion, where the Dark Brotherhood is an assassin guild, so they're evil. But there's a point in spoiler alert for anyone who wants to do this quest line. There's a point at which you start turning against the Dark Brotherhood, but not because it's your choice. It's because you've been manipulated by somebody who's been leaving dead drops with instructions for you to kill and assassinate people who are like top tier Dark Brotherhood members. And it's not until it's too late and that you've killed pretty much everyone that you realize what's happened. So it's interesting. The concept of evil campaigns is always interesting to me, because there's always the argument from everyone that I talk to about this, that the players and their characters are generally good, or at least good aligned, or neutral.
And generally people are generally good. or at least like as players will tend toward, oh, I don't want to hurt the cat, I don't want to hurt the puppy. I don't want to attack the wolves that are attacking me and might cause a TPK because I love the dogs. I don't want to hurt the dogs even though they're killing us. Sorry, continue.
No, actually that was on a podcast I was listening to before. That's kind of funny you mention it. But yeah, so generally speaking, players are good or neutral aligned whenever they're playing their characters. And so creating an evil aligned campaign, which is, it sounds like, I mean, it's still probably grayer than evil, but which sounds like what you're doing. It's always an interesting proposition because there's some sort of like balancing act that you have to figure out of whether or not you want or whether or not the players ultimately want to, destroy the world, or if they're just trying to further an evil aligned agenda.
I think that it's going to be, because there are certain things that are just not allowed at my table. And I'm not going to go the route of, you're these evil professions, like a torturer. Like we're not going to go there. But instead what we have is the antithesis party. We have the opposite party. We have the agendas that are going to come into conflict with each other. And it might be interesting to run the two groups and not realize that,
Yeah.
Maybe they don't conflict, but there's a possibility that they do. And it's, I don't know. It's interesting to ponder. Yeah, John.
I think you've got to define, because I think you've got to define evil, like what you're considering an evil or a dark character, because D&D alignment is very kind of black and white morality, where it's like, mustache twirling villain versus dashing prince, like that tends to be a lot of the archetypes they play to. And I think the first thing you have to answer is scale, because like when we played Dragon Heist, right, the villains I chose for that campaign were the Castellantars. And another potential villain was Jarlaxle. Now, in your guys' game, because the Castellantars were the villain, you were actually able to recruit Jarlaxle as an ally. His alignment is neutral, but he could have been the villain the whole time, It's just that for this one, and the Castellantars, if they had gotten away with it, really 100 people would have died. It's like, it's really bad, It's like they spiked the punch and we're going to kill everybody at the party. But it wasn't like world ending, like an evil agenda. You've got to really ask, first of all, why is it evil? And are you creating a party that's sympathetic? So like, to bring it back to Avatar, my favorite season of Korra is the one with the Red Lotus, where, they're just a tight team of very like specialist benders that are just really, really good at violence, and in their head, they're the good guys. Kind of like that's what makes Thanos kind of an engaging villain. So it'd be interesting if, like, your Dark Owls we're willing to do evil things because we know the truth that there's, like, corruption in the Night Owls organization, and we're fighting the system. And in their head, they're kind of heroic, whereas the Night Owls, who are traditionally heroic, the twist at the end is it turns out, kind of like with season 3, what we just did, all those monsters we just destroyed were the ones keeping the evil back. So it becomes, and it's funny you mentioned that, Ian, because technically I'm running an evil character in your Curse of Strahd campaign. And I still have to send you like my 10 questions or whatever, but like the whole thing is that he is willing to be the monster in service of slaying other monsters, but that doesn't make him any less of a monster. Like playing Alucard, he's bad. Like, he's evil. He likes killing people. Like, he's not a good or a neutral character. He's evil. But also, at what point is the party willing to tolerate his evil for the net good that he eventually does? So a lot of times, you'll hear this. I had it with your teenager group at some point, Adamus, where they all decided to make chaotic evil characters. They stabbed each other in the back and they TPK'd because they kept running and wouldn't help each other, So that's one kind of evil. Rick from Rick and Morty is classic chaotic evil. He's not a good person, you know? He is evil. And he is still like the protagonist of the story, you know? So he's the one that arguably might be going through the most change. You might say the same about Morty, but the idea is that like what's the purpose of their evil in the evil campaign? Is it so that we can explore another facet of ourselves that we might be too embarrassed to in another conversation? Is it you're taking them through a redemption arc? Is it that they think they're the good guys, but they're actually doing evil acts? Like, where does the evil fit into the design of the character, you know?
Yeah, and that's gonna be really fun to explore. Just the initial thoughts were to have that there's an opposition to their organizations, that their ideas would conflict. But I do like the idea that they're when it comes to the different striations of evil, like the really chaotic evil creatures, there's a whole set in the Shadowfell of vampire courts. That there are different lords of vampires that run sections of the Shadowfell. They're part of the major noble houses. And there's a red court, which are the glamored ones. They look very, human and beautiful, and they're like the ones who run a society, but they can become monstrous, and they're always kind of at odds with their levels of humanity and their monstrosity, but they have to strike a balance because society needs to run. And then you have like white court and green court and blue court, and they all have different ways of them like sucking the life out of creatures, but they have different roles in society. And then you have the dark court, also called the black court, and they're the ones they're the monsters. There are so few of them because monster hunters slay them. There's so few of them because they can't, they don't mitigate their thirst. They just go on killing sprees. They're the ones that are in some ways, some of them had to be destroyed by the red court because they are breaking the balance. And I like the idea that the things that are truly evil, the truly monstrous creatures that cannot control themselves, those are the things that often there are less of them because they don't survive. They become the evil that are temporary. And everyone goes, we got to stop those guys. And somebody puts them down. But the ones that are the deeper layers that understand that there's a big, that they have a point to their society, or they need to, we need to make sure, even if they view creatures as cattle, they go, well, there needs to be enough cattle for us to survive, guys. Stop killing all the mortals, please. You've eaten too much. You need to go away now. Oh, you're not going to go away? Well, I'll destroy you then. And then you have a red court hero for a time being, but they had to make the difficult decision. And it makes me think about what is the line that some of these creatures are allowed to cross? When do they cross it? And where's the spectrum in between? Because they can be willing to do monstrous, horrible things against another creature's moral code. And to that other creature's moral code, they are evil. But they could also be sympathetic because they're striking a balance between them, or they only cross this line when this is threatened. That's why lawful evil creatures are so interesting to me, because there's a code that they still follow. There are rules to these things. That's why a crime boss is like, you don't kill kids. Duh. Like they could still take evil acts, but there are certain lines that they just do not cross because it's bad for business.
Well, and there one of the things that made me think of just now was a really interesting, I'm pretty sure it was Chris Perkins, but I could be wrong. When Descent into Avernus came out, right? One of the things that he said was that, when you're going to hell, like you're going to the first layer or whatever, like paladins and clerics are going to have the best time down there because it's confirming their faith and belief right in front of them. There's no denying the devil that you're running your magic sword through is bad. Like you understand. It's so clear, like paladins would probably have the easiest time because they've dedicated themselves to fighting a very specific idea of what monsters are, and that faith is validated. A character that's morally ambiguous, like a rogue, might like a typical like thief rogue might have a harder time because now they see what happens if you justify your evil too much, you know? So a rogue that's like, I'm pretty sure I'll be able to sneak out of it. No, they can see this devil used to be a human soul just like me that used to, all they did was pickpocket, but then they got into one bad scuffle and somebody hit their head and now they're here. If I don't turn my life around, now I'm going to end up like that. So it's interesting when you start playing with concepts of, first of all, what does it mean to be monstrous? The whole point of The Witcher is that humans end up being the worst monsters. What monsters are really the worst, you know? Like, there would be a lot of people, Adam, that would argue the opposite, that, like, lawful evil monsters are, like, the worst and they'd hate to deal with them because they feel justified in their own head and they can't see that they're evil, you know? Whereas, like, if you have something that's kind of chaotic, like the Order of the Black Court, like you were saying with vampires, it's a bad vampire. You kill it. It's why a lot of people hate Twilight, because they try to make something monstrous look too appealing, you know? And it's like, well, you don't realize that they're dead people. And they probably killed people at some point. And that's, like, Julia's rewatching The Vampire Diaries right now. And one of the things that drives me, like bananas about that show, they kill people all the time and they just don't ever investigate. And it's like, and they'll be like, oh, you're not a bad person. Yeah, he is. He just ate 10 people. That's a pretty bad thing to do. There's like that, oh, but he means well, but he just killed people. Like, at what point, like you said, what's the line, you know?
Yeah, and man, we're all talking about vampires now, so I got to talk about this one too. There's a Netflix mini series that's like an hour long each episode, 3 episodes. It's I think it's literally called Dracula or something like that, and it's a live action where it is exploring the classic story. Classic Bram Stoker kind of ideas with whoever directed it, their little twist. And it talks about how Dracula is civilized basically until he's not, because he just, at some point, he just can't control himself because he's just that hungry. So he, like, even when he, rounds up like people and puts them in his castle and drinks their blood from like a little goblet thing, like that's really just to make himself feel better, I think. And throughout the series, I'm going to try to avoid spoilers, but throughout the series it's exploring why he is much more human than he appears to be, even though he's a vampire. And it's showing how the myths of men can really make the monster, because it is the fear that we have in our hearts. This is one of those like classic theories these days, I think, that it's the fear that we have in our hearts that creates our worst nightmares and really like it powers them, it fuels them. That's why I like in my homebrew world, Corsara, I like the idea of how faith is like the fuel of the gods. It's how they derive sustenance. If you don't have followers, then eventually your deity, like your divinity, is going to turn into a lesser deity and eventually turn into just a patron or something like that. But it goes both ways. So with the Raven Queen, for example, I think it's in Tome of Foes or something. They talk about an elven queen who saw that Corellon and whoever Corellon's sister is, I can't remember. Do you guys know who the other elven deity is? Because I can't remember.
Sehanine is not his sister.
Oh, I don't know. Maybe I was thinking.
Yeah.
I was probably mixing up with Tiamat.
Technically, might be in there
it's,
somewhere, but we don't know.
Yeah, it's an Athena. It's an Athena thing because it's when he got hit by Grumsh's axe, he bled, and that blood became the elves, and one of the elves ascended to Sehanine. And
okay.
she's now his wife. So technically,
there you go.
Technically, it's kind of parts of him that just different.
Gods are weird.
Yeah.
Well, anyways, Corellon and the other one, They're like arguing at some point. So this elven queen is like, they're not going to listen to me. They're going to like destroy everything if they don't listen to reason. So I'm going to gather all of my citizens, and we're going to do this cool ritual where they're basically going to pour all their power into me, and I'm going to ascend to become a divine, to smack them around a little bit. And I just think that's a really cool concept because it shows that there's like a transfer of power between mortals and divinities, and that it can really work both ways in that sense. Now, my point here was that this is all to exemplify the power of belief in mortals and characters. The guy who wrote American Gods, Neil Gaiman, does a similar thing and says that the more that you believe in something, the more likely it is to come true. And the same thing happens in Good Omens, which is another book that he wrote together with Terry Pratchett. So for me, the dynamic between mortals and monsters is really interesting because it's not like they're separate from one another. We say that like, yeah, mortals, humans, can be the worst monsters, but it's also that they can create the worst monsters. Monsters can inspire the worst in humans. So I don't know. There's like a whole. It's not just cut and dry. It's very fluid, if you ask me.
So speaking of changing the number of players you usually have at a table, segue.
Yeah. We are professionals. Yeah, no, really. I mean, this is a really good discussion, and I appreciate it. We'll draw it to a close to harken back to something that we started to mention here and there so far today, and it has to do with trust, and then the dynamic change in players, and then in the climax of Night Owls, due to scheduling and our current situation, as well as just some zaniness, it became very difficult to get. We've been having Team Discord, which is 4 people, where we use Discord as the main communication through Roll20, I guess alongside Roll20, and then we have a Team Roll20 that is everything is in Roll20. So, and that was a team of 4 and a team of 6, and we were running double the Night Owls in different missions as a way to kind of get everybody as much as we could. And it came time to do the climax, and I ran out of time to let people know, and that was kind of a failing on my part. But it made it so I was able to move over 1 player from Team Discord, who was able to jump over to Roll20. So we had a group of 7. But any more than that, it was going to really bog things down. And as it was, we rolled with it pretty well. But it also meant we had 2, like I mentioned before, this season had a lot more emotional investment felt by more players than any other season. So as a way to make a conclusion that was impactful and important, and hopefully satisfying for 2 players that had great impact in the whole campaign so far, even though they couldn't join us for that segment, I ran a 6-hour messenger narrative only, no rolling to speak of.
Now, this makes it sound like we sat down and like committed to this. We did not. This was just like the total chat took about like spanned 6 hours.
Yeah.
But it was very much like message, I'm going to get up and do my laundry and then come back and look, another message, I'm going to go do my dishes. Like it was very relaxing. Like it was probably the most relaxing D&D I've ever played.
So I ran a chat, and it was a text adventure for the characters of Kurama and Eld in the penultimate conflict before the big fight with Cuse, the worm that walks. We'll talk about another time. And one, just to put it out there, so this was with Kurama, John's character, and Eld, Ian's character. And because I decided on the fly, I was about to how do I run this like we're about to enter combat. How do I do this? No, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to do it. I'm going to trust them. And it was an honor to have the 2 of you trust me and for you, for me to trust you, and to really satisfy that. Yeah, I was not disappointed or let down by any of that. But we walked through a narrative book essentially, and it will be released as a fiction in some form. I'll make some edits to it, but we had a really good chat log. So I was describing everything that happened. We'd have speech back and forth if we decided, you know what, it fits better if this happens before this, or this concludes this way. We as a collective group made those decisions. And to have a combat where normally there's luck involved, and to treat it as a strict, completely strict narrative, creative writing exercise with a give and a take. I put that up front and checked to make sure that you were too okay with that. And you said, yep, let's do it. I appreciate that he swings at you, and we treated it like I'm going to describe to you the action that's coming towards you, and then you describe how you respond, and then that closes that action, and then there's another action, and we have I throw it at you, and then there's a response. There's a question, and then there's a response, and that's how we deal with every resolution. And it made it so, does he hit you, or do you block it in this cool way, or do you barely get out of the way? Or with less experienced individuals that did not buy into this cooperation, I could see this rapidly devolving into, well, of course I don't get hit because my character doesn't get hit. Or of course I hit you because my character would of course hit you. Or they would abuse, oh, there's no rolls, no luck, then I automatically win. You know, I hit triangle and I win. The Kingdom Hearts model. But this was truly inspiring because it became a wonderful culmination of all of our rapport and our relationship. Because by the first time one of you like took a hit, it allowed me to also take a hit. It wasn't a 1-for-1, but it let me bank, you know what, story-wise, this would look really cool if, you know, he's surprised by this and it explodes in his face. And story-wise, this looks really cool if you allow me to hit you right now. It kind of flows really well when you start thinking about it like beat for beat, like a big cinematic event. Go ahead.
Yeah, so one of the moments there, and it allowed us to simulate the risk reward without the actual action of rolling dice. So one of the reasons this also worked out was like just based on where Ian was, he didn't have any dice. So like he couldn't roll, and we could have tried an app thing, but he was mostly doing this from his phone, and I was doing it from my laptop, and it seemed like more of a hassle to like try to bring in an artificial construct when we agreed what we wanted by the end of this. We were looking for a narrative conclusion. We were not looking for gameplay or the gambler's rush of, oh, am I gonna succeed or fail, you know? So one of the things that happened is like Adamus described like an AoE attack that ended up being like a big gust. So thinking through Kurama, who's a druid, like what druid magic would make sense to let him like stay in place and not get moved. So like it was like cool to be able to be like, well, vines shoot out of the ground and wrap around his ankles, which fasten him to the ground. Also, that means he can't dodge when like the dude comes in. So it was more following through the logic of the fight than interpreting the randomness, like you said, of what the dice roll means. You know, the reason the dice roll is there is so that you can partake in the spontaneous creation of a story. If we trust each other not to actually follow through on the logic of what makes sense, you know, that's a different thing. And it ended up being Kurama's plan to get hit, because if he's close enough to get hit, that's when he planted the death seed, which ended up being the thing that ended up winning the fight overall. But like like you said, it was a give and take. It's like Kurama gets hit. Now Kurama's in a bloodied state. Also, he literally planted the seed that's going to finish the fight. So do we get the same risk reward, you know?
Yeah, and that's kind of funny because Eld is pretty much a blaster. Like he has some control elements and stuff, but for the most part, he's a Sorlock. He's gonna quicken Eldritch Blast, do 8d10 if he can, or do whatever else he wants. But it's interesting because Kurama, you've played him mostly as a support control character throughout the times that we've just played together, and it's cool to me that there's like a layer that even we may not have like acknowledged, where Eld is kind of a distraction for this enemy, whereas Kurama is what brings in the final blow, because Eld demonstrated that he has the ability to stop time, for one, because I use time stop, of course, for in case anybody's wondering where that came from. But I use time stop, and I use delayed blast fireball, and like these are very big, flashy moves. So something more subtle that Kurama would do might go unnoticed in that case. For example, when he planted the seed, it kind of just looked like he slapped him in the face, and I thought that was kind of funny, and I wasn't sure where he was going with it at first, but yeah, it really paid off. So for me, this whole story is like pretty much everything I've imagined my storytelling to be through Dungeons and Dragons, just without most of the gameplay, like we said, the mechanics. And I was fortunate enough to understand how Eld generally plays out a fight and what kind of tricks he has up his sleeve to not need my character sheet or any dice, because he's not only is a Sorlock, but he's also a wild magic sorcerer. So, wild magic, it does crazy things, and not always what you want it to do. So but what was cool is that we didn't like even look at the table, I think, for this fight, for wild magic, even though it happened. A lot of the things that wild magic did were either beneficial or neutral in the scenario, or in one case, very detrimental because it hurt Eld a lot with like necrotic damage. But for the most part, it was just cool to be able to use the concept of wild magic and supplement it with what we think would be really useful or really just awesome to see. And I that's what I really appreciated, is creating this unique scenario where we are taking it way beyond what the player's handbook probably had in mind for this kind of encounter. And like you said, it was like an honor for me to be able to take part in that, because I couldn't see that story ending any other way, really. And that's what I loved about it.
The big thing is when I read through the interaction again before this podcast, and the thing I find so exciting about it, I was reading through it and I was seeing the actions play out in like an anime. It felt like an anime fight. And I've run a game called Exalted, like level 1, very basic concept. Level 1, you're gods. Like the things that you do at level 1 is you destroy a football field throwing, like pieces of the moon at somebody. It's nuts. This felt though like an Exalted fight, which is an anime fight, which is everyone's level 20, and this is the type of stuff you can throw down with. And by all of you have had experience describing things and describing the cinematic flow, the narrative flow of how these worlds work and how your characters interact and how they interact with other characters. We have a lot of practice. I would argue more practice than the average player. We have a lot of practice doing that. Some players have lots of it, but on average. This also opens the door that when you describe something, it gave me an opportunity to then complement your description. It doesn't just be, I do something cool to him, and then it's my responsibility to describe it. You describe something, and then I jump off of it and continue the flow. And then John jumps off of what I wrote, and then I respond to what John wrote. And then it's a give and take, and it flowed. It flows really well. And it also, when you think about it, when we were describing action by action, it reads like a novel, and it reads like comic book panels, or it reads like one of those amazing 6-minute fights that you watch online that you take out of an anime where they blow all of their animation budget on this one thing, and it might be over really in 6 moves, but those 6 moves are epic. And it was so cool to have that, and then to have it close with a clutch move that I was so energized and involved in the story I completely forgot about. I took note that Kurama, like, he touched the gauntlet and then got knocked away, Captain Marvel style, and then just went, by the way, I do that. And it's like, oh my gosh, I forgot about that. You got me. Let's describe something cool. Instead of, what can you do to save against it? It's, no.
Yeah.
That's amazing. That's appropriate. That's amazing. Let's do it. That's a gotcha. Let's go.
And I think that's the key thing that was so energizing about this. And again, like you said, this is not something I would feel comfortable trying with just anybody. This could devolve into this is why Batman would beat Superman argument thing, you know, where it's more just it turns into a thought experiment of why you're right, not can we create the best story, you know, which is the game structure is there to balance out what everybody say, basically, in their contribution to the story. So if Ian is playing a fighter and I'm playing a monk and Adam's playing a druid, the game mechanics are there to balance each other out so that Adam doesn't get more screen time than I do in the fight, you know. And obviously, the system's not perfect, but also because it's an artificial system that's been designed to be balanced, there are going to be certain cinematic moments that the system doesn't allow for. So by being able to, and like if you had to be like, oh, John, when you put the seed in the guy's armor and it exploded into thorns, isn't that like a wall of thorns spell? Well, yeah. But if we were to play that out in the game, it's like, oh, now he has to make a dex save and it does 7d6 damage and like he ends up taking 20 and it becomes a game of tracking numbers instead of like, no, a whole wall of thorns just exploded from inside of him. Like, that's going to do more than 7d6 slashing damage.
Yeah.
At what point, what do the numbers really represent when you're looking at what does the moment represent for the story and the feel for the story? So by cutting away the artificial mechanics of even needing to say, what spell are you using? You know, does it take an action or a bonus action?
Mm-hmm.
But by removing that and breaking it down to a flow of cinematic moments, we created a really cool story that I don't think you'd be able to tell in like a normal game setting, you know?
There was a point even during like early on in describing things that this was a testament to you, Ian, that you wanted to make sure that I'm doing this right. That you're not going to, you know, I want to make sure that you know that I'm using the right abilities. And you had described this thing and you're like, I'm using this spell, by the way. And I like later responded like, I trust you. It's okay. Just describe what you're doing. We're going to go with it. And because that means I know that you know your character, you know the mechanics of the game, you know your action economy, you know what's possible. And this way you can just describe what happens. This is going to be epic level play. We might go over the top. That's okay. And it ended in a wonderful way of, like, I was rolling for the wild magic, but then I wouldn't tell you like what happens mechanically. I would describe this happens. And, you know, like a shockwave of poison, a poisonous cloud comes out. There was a point where Eld pulled off this cool spell, like a whole bunch of Eldritch Blasts and an extra spell on top of that, and then was driven to his knees as he chokes up poisonous gas. And that was, you poisoned yourself through wild magic. But I don't have to tell you that. It's just, ow. And all the while, we had this running narrative that Eld keeps pushing himself further and further and further as more and more of that poison takes hold. So he's getting like really beat up as he's trying to pull off more and more magic all at once. And the winter ability of Auril starting to like push through him and trying to, you know, fortify him while his body's beginning to give out. That is a narrative structure. It doesn't have mechanics. That's purely a story. and it's a progression of a fight. And then to watch Kurama have a heartfelt moment with Eld before he takes the Death Knight down into a tree, and just basically be able to tell him. And the way that John gave this speech was really poignant. I sat back and went, oh my God. Kurama's basically telling him, I'm dead. Like or this is my, I'm passing on. He said his goodbyes in that moment. And it became suddenly like, wow, I wasn't expecting to have an emotional investment here. And there it was. And it also opened the door to have an emotional connection to what was actually going on inside the Death Knight, which is a creature that is actually being manipulated through another force. And it opened the door to be able to have those key interactions, whereas we might have had to make so many rolls had we run it in this other way. And maybe wouldn't have had that opportunity because it just wouldn't have played out the same way. I was so pleased to be able to run that with the two of you, and it was a shot in the dark opportunity. There's a great silver lining. I'm sorry that we couldn't play in the bigger group, and this was pretty cool.
And there's a key lesson here too in terms of running a game that you just kind of mentioned, which is, would you need to have made a bunch of rules for that? Because this ties back into what Ian's original question was, which is the game designed to make all these perception checks? Well, does the DM need to have players make that many perception checks? Or can it just happen? How many times has that happened where like a player has a really like cool, neat idea, and you as the storyteller want it to work, and you have them roll and they don't roll well. So you're like, you have advantage, roll again. Why do they have advantage besides the fact you want to see it play out? And if you want to see it play out,
just let it play out.
Just let it play out. Don't even like worry about it. And you know what? If it's one of those things like, oh, what exact spell are you using? What's the purpose of having an exact spell besides the fact that you're consuming an appropriate spell slot as your resource? So like if it's one of those things where I want to do this really cool spell, well, it's not a spell that's designed for the game for an artificial balance to make sure everyone has their own say. It's, well, blow an 8th level spell slot, describe what you're doing. We'll see how that description affects the overall thing, Let's say the Death Knight has 180 hit points, and Eld dealt it 60. I basically give up an 8th level spell slot to deal with the other 120, So it's like, at what point does what a dungeon master thinks they have to do to keep the game running, and when does that start to get in the way of the storytelling and why everybody's actually here,
Yeah.
And for some people, it is the randomness. The reason they're here is to roll dice, see what happens, have that gambler's rush of, I'm not sure if this is going to succeed. For some people, they're here for the big cinematic moments, for the emotional investment. And when the mechanics start to become a restrictive construction, or a restrictive construct to that, then it might be appropriate to take certain mechanics away. And that's also not to say mechanics just need to be taken away. Like carry weight has ended up being one of those things where by enforcing carry weight, it actually makes you consider what your character is carrying. And it actually immerses you more because now you've actually thought out what your character looks like. And it makes sense to why they would be wearing what they wear, Yeah. So mechanics do have their place. It's just, it was a really interesting look at, do we actually need these rules? Or are the rules just a common language for us to be able to describe things to each other? I think what this really demonstrated was, you can do this with other people that have proven themselves to be dungeon masters, and everyone has to agree to what they're going into along the way.
And it's these kinds of concepts that really excite me. I know I probably say this like every episode that we do, but it's these kinds of things that really excite me about D&D, because it all feeds into just creating this really amazing experience for everyone, and we're all ultimately working towards that experience. Even when people have like hot takes on certain rulings, or if there's conflict between characters, and then that kind of transfers into like a real life conflict. But in the end, as long as we keep that idea in mind, that we're all just trying to have fun together, you know, I know it sounds very simple and cheesy, but if we all just remember why we're here, then it can really make a difference.
And it was really cool to recognize that all of us were there to have a satisfying narrative conclusion, and kind of, in a way, set up at least where those two characters that interacted in that space, how they would influence the following big boss battle, which we'll probably talk about another time. But it was cool that the throwbacks that I did, not even throwbacks, the moments that help arrived or that were present, that were influenced based upon how you two interacted narratively in this space. So also informed me of how you're going to show up essentially during this fight and how you can help out. But that is all, that when that happened in real time, the other players went, "It's okay, Kurama, we're going to stop him." Or they saw like an ice claw fly out from the far end of the continent and hold open the door when it was closing. And it felt like that's the right moment for that to come through, because they started to see glimpses of ice moving where Eld is trying to reach them. And they're like, wait, is that Eld? Oh my God, that's Eld. And then something shoots out of the air and holds something open, and you're like, okay, guys, go. And then that's the signal. And they got so excited. They cheered to have that happen and to have, vines shoot up and block an attack from somebody. That's Kurama's influence. He just needed some time to get to them. But then to have them like whisper, "We'll stop him, Kurama, don't worry." It was totally unnecessary. Like, John's not there. He doesn't hear it. But from this universe that we've built up together, it was so poignant for this character to pick up a rose and just put it in his armor and say, "It's okay, Kurama, we'll win." That was Matthew's character.
Oh, very cool.
So one of the other characters, the character that jumped over, that has spent a long time with Eld and Kurama, was really channeling and recognizing, paying close attention to those little hints that I would put into the narrative to go, wait, that's my friend coming to help. It was so cool.
And like I said before, I think that the thing that will cement this world as such a deep and enriching experience to come back to is those legacy games. I'm like really pushing them because I think that it's kind of like the MCU, which is what we've said a lot of the time, where you get to see these characters kind of come back and interact in different ways and everything, and that's something that I think is pretty cool.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for tuning in to today's episode of the DM Shower Thoughts. You can find this podcast coming up on Podbean, most Fridays at noon, and on iTunes also at noon, as well as we have our YouTube channel, DM Shower Thoughts, over at youtube.com, and you can find entries by all three of us now at some point over at the GM's Corner, so John's Study Hall for John, Notes from the Apprentice for Ian, and then the GM's Corner for myself, and those go up often during the week over at the GM's Corner at AdamStrakeProductions.com. Have a wonderful, wonderful day, everybody, and please game responsibly. Bye-bye now.